Deckelman, and please make her welcome. Thank you.
All right, hi, thank you. And thank you for bringing me a glass of water. Awesome. So my name is Selena Deckelman, and I founded a company called Prime Radiant that's actually working on these issues of failure, trying to help companies fail a little bit less. Thank you. So this talk is about failure. And I've heard people use various euphemisms to describe this, such as prevention, risk management, risk mitigation. There's some metrics around it: mean time between failure, mean time to recovery. And I think the most saccharine and not very useful one is success engineering.
That's engineering, right?
That clearly will work, right? So I think about this a lot. Sorry, I don't know why there's feedback, but and what I've kind of distilled this down to, and I gave this talk once before, and I tried to learn a little bit from that talk as well, and I realized there was one thing that I had left out of my list before, but I've kind of distilled out the lessons I've learned. I've worked in IT, system administration, network engineering, and as a DBA, which was probably the most full of fail. And these are the things that I try to remind myself of every time I'm in a situation where I'm dealing with a software upgrade, a maintenance window, an outage, anything like that. The first thing is to plan for the worst. The second thing is to minimize the risk, and I actually don't think that you can eliminate risk. I don't know, is there anybody here that thinks you can eliminate risk? Oh, good. Pessimism, I like it. Third thing is, you're gonna fail. I don't know if it's going to be a small failure or a big failure, but just preparing yourself for that and knowing that it's going to happen is actually quite helpful. And then finally, recovering gracefully. And I add the gracefully there because recovery can come in many forms. Those of you who are familiar with the alt system in recovery know all about this. But I think gracefully is an important aspect of learning from your mistakes. Unfortunately, I'm not the only one that talks about this. There's a lot of talk about failure. There's Fail Blog. There's the daily WTF, which is great for stories. And recently, Jim Hightower actually talked specifically about risk management and risk mitigation. And he was, I think, actually working on a software project where a project manager came to and told him that they did not need a risk management plan and did not want to spend the time or money on it because the project could not be allowed to fail. And the response to this was so great. There was so much great commentary on this, and I think this was my favorite. Oh dear, they don't really know how this works, do they? No, they don't. So the first step in any of this is admitting that failure is an option and that it will happen. And I think particularly in web operations and in free and open source software, we fail and we fix things all the time. And this is actually kind of a core competency of ours, like that we do pretty well in our projects and something that we can export out to the world. But I don't know that we do it systematically enough to really export it right now, but maybe. Fortunately, there are some people out there studying failure, which I love. There's this guy, Jerker Denrell, and sorry about, I hope nobody has any seizures. This will all be over soon. So this guy, Jerker Denrell, he's done a lot of studying in the business world about failure, and he publishes these fantastically titled papers about his research. And most of it is focused on the fact that business schools in general focus on only the success stories out there and not so much on the failure, which, fundamentally is a problem since most businesses fail. And his latest paper that he published had this great title, which I'll just read it from over here. Predicting the next big thing, success as a signal of poor judgment. And what they had done is they looked at people who were, predicting important events, kind of black swan type events, and then looked at the rest of their track record. And they did this both in kind of an experimental way, and they also just took the Wall Street Journal and pulled predictions from people, so they have this great data source for this now, and they found that it was negatively correlated with judgment, predicting an important event. I thought that was awesome. There's this other book called Everything is Obvious that I've been reading. And it's all about common sense, causality, and hindsight. And most of us are familiar with the, correlation is not causality, right? And this book talks a lot about those issues and some of the problems with the way that history is interpreted and how that important events. So is my laptop the one that's doing this? AV in the back? Hello? Is my laptop the one that keeps cycling through the... Yeah, I did. Sorry, I want to fix that because that's really distracting, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Failure isn't an option here.
The current CD is your one.
Okay.
There's another one for you.
There's another one. There it is. Hello. Oh, yeah. Ah! No, really, do it.
And this one can go on to...
Confirm.
Confirm! Oh, God! It takes a room full of engineers. Okay. I didn't hear that. I'm sure it was sarcastic. Thank you. So everything is obvious, even configuring your laptop for presentations. And there's just some really great stuff in this book about social phenomena, the social phenomena that produces successes, and how we attribute causality to those successes, and that there's a fundamental problem with society if we don't start studying more of the failures instead of the successes. So there's research out there supporting this, and I think that you're going to see more really interesting science about this in the near future. So anyway, so whatever, science, blah. This talk is really a series of anecdotes that friends of mine, people actually that I didn't know very well even. This one comes from New Zealand, which I met somebody at OzCon last year that told me this story, and I did actually look it up in the news so that I wouldn't get it wrong now that I'm actually in the part of the world that would know about it. Basically what happened is that all of New Zealand went offline. This was about in 2005. Some of you here may have anyone present for that. Yeah, many of you, right? So you know this story. Long story short, there was a little rat, maybe a whole nest of rats, I don't know, that made a home in a very important fiber optic cable. And eventually they chewed through it, right? So they chewed through this cable, and okay, of course there's a backup cable, right? And yeah, guess what? There was totally a backup cable on the other side of the island. Unfortunately, on the day that this happened, there was a construction crew. And they cut through that other cable. And this in and of itself isn't the end of the world, right? Like, surely you can recover from that. But the problem was that the phone service was also running through this. So internet and phone were taken offline at the same time. So what was really great about the news articles is this totally it's just like perfectly reinforcing my point in this talk. Getting two accidents of this type at the same time are freak occurrence. And what's funny is, so I was sitting in Melbourne just a couple days ago, and I was sitting with my friend Karen, and she's like, "Oh, this is an amazing story. I'd never heard of rats taking down an entire country." She found another one. But so that's not the end, right? This is so amazing. I was like, I can't believe this happened again, right? Rats, intercabling. So it happened on a Monday. And they had it back again on Tuesday. So it happened again. So, okay, yeah, sure. It's a freak occurrence, but wow. Yeah, it happens. So anyway, point in all this is I think that we all need to plan for when things are going to fail, and we need to use the stories that are out there about these failures to help inform how we protect ourselves and our customers and our friends from what inevitably happens. So there's another person in the DevOps community that occasionally dresses up in a firefighter's costume because he's actually a volunteer firefighter. And so when I was thinking about this, this is a very classic, I don't know, did they do this in Australia, New Zealand, the stop, drop, and roll? So I looked through, I don't know, sorry, I laughed too loud, but trying to protect you from my laugh here. So this was the most hilarious one. I looked at thousands of these, and this was by far the best. And so I thought I would translate this into what ops people should do. Because I think it's pretty simple, right? And like, who better to help us than Cookie Monster? Yeah. So anyway, so I hope you don't find this too insulting. I just thought it was hilarious. I really think that it's three basic things to prevent, well, maybe not prevent, but to help you deal with failure. Document, test, and verify. And this is also something that's really easy to explain to your management, right? Simple words, small. So all the rest of this are just some stories. People were really generous with their awesome stories. So this first one is about a failure to document. I forget the name of this blog right now. It's something like There I Did It. There I Fixed It. Yes, best blog ever. Love it. So this one, that is actually a server rack that someone was moving from data center to data center. They were actually moving it to another data center. So this guy David contacted me and let me know that he had installed a server at some major hosting provider, whatever, and they were doing a maintenance window. And they, notified him, let him know what was going on, told him the times, like everything was good. And then the engineers get to the data center and they take everything out of the rack. Well, almost. They get to his server, David's server, and they couldn't unscrew it. It was stuck. So I've totally had this happen to me before. But anyway, so that happened and they were like, oh, okay, so well, what we'll do is we'll just leave it in that rack, we'll move everything else, and we'll come back and fix that server in some future maintenance window. So a couple days go by. David's server's not back up. And he's like, what's going on? And it wasn't that important of a thing. I think it was like a test server or something. So he contacts them, tries to figure out what was going on. And they're like, no, it was in our scripts. Like, it totally should come back up. I don't know. Okay, we'll send somebody out there to check it out. So I looked at it, and it was still off. And basically what had happened is that they went through, and they had left that server there, and their startup script relied on someone saying that the server had moved. And when the server moved, everything could come back up. Well, that server didn't move. So, yeah. So really simple failure, but one that resulted in 2 or 3 days of downtime. So I think failures to document often come down to one thing, which is writing documentation. That didn't happen in that case, but I think the first step for all of us is to write documentation. And that may be actually in the form of code, but leave that as an exercise to the audience. And then the second biggest failure that I see in my work life is updating that documentation. I count myself among those people. Updating documentation sucks. There's a lot of reasons why it sucks, but it's hard. So one of the things that I've tried doing in all of my operations work is making updating the documentation a step in the plan. Whether it's step 10 or step 2, I don't know, but adding it to your plan makes a huge difference because it's right in front of you when you're going through, hopefully you have a checklist, going through your plan and executing it. And then the other trick that I've added over time is putting a fixed amount of time to it. Because often these documentation updates, it's seriously like 60 seconds and you would fix a small typo or something important so the next person that comes along doesn't stumble on it. But when you don't have a fixed amount of time set to it, you're like, oh, it's gonna take like a month, like an hour maybe to fire up the browser and log in and blah, whatever. But if you just say, okay, I'm gonna spend 5 or 10 minutes on this and then I'm gonna stop, then at least you get something in there rather than nothing. Some of the documentation tools out there are really terrible. I think one thing that would help us all are having some graphic designers come in and show us how it's done. Wikis have terrible user interfaces. They just look truly awful, and I don't blame people for not wanting to update them. I have seen some pretty neat stuff out of Sphinx and some default templates that look quite nice for those of us that use Python around here. And I think small diagrams, even if they're sketched out, and you take a photograph of it with your phone and put it up, that can solve a lot of confusion. Picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Doing that can help a lot. Having timelines for the documentation that explain, when you're supposed to update it, also how long operational changes are going to take, that really helps. Having a bug trackers really help, which I'm kind of a hypocrite here. I work with the Postgres project and we don't have a bug tracker, but bug tracking really helps. And finally, I think ordered to-do lists. Whenever you're dealing with maintenance operations, actually making the list and sharing it with people and numbering it helps everyone know what's actually going to happen. So my second failure story, or I guess this is like the third failure story, is about the failure to test. So in my first job, I made a lot of really awesome friends. And one of my friends told me about when she first started as a sysadmin, and she was actually hired as a technical writer, but they gave her root. And so she was sitting one day, and it was like her first day on the job, and she's like, oh, nobody really gave me anything to do. What should I do? Oh, I should tidy this up. So she starts looking around, and she's like, oh, there's all these zero-length files. That seems really messy. She's like, oh, I just learned how to use this command find. Okay, so find dot slash zero length, blah, 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 blah. Oh, there's a lot of these. All right, I just use dash delete, return. Oops. Fortunately, they had a backup, and they had to restore it from backup. It's a Solaris box. But anyway, oops. So this I do really think is a failure to test. And one of the things about testing is that you need to verify what your success criteria is. What does success look like? It probably doesn't look like needing to restore from a backup, for starters. And had she taken a moment and asked someone, I'm sure that someone would have been like, oh God, don't do that, but she didn't. So anyway, first of all, verify your success criteria. Second of all, actually write the tests. And this can be very simple, right? It can just be a shell script. It doesn't have to be complicated. The third thing is testing with a buddy. I think that, again, having that second set of eyes on what you're doing is super helpful. And finally, just having a plan. Like, she didn't really have a plan. Just wanted to tidy things up a little bit. And when you have a plan, I would say that plan should involve other people. For testing tools, there's a lot of testing frameworks out there in whatever language that you want to use. So if you're a developer, you can go out there and use your favorite one. I think repeatable shell scripts are incredibly underutilized. I know that configuration management and deployment tools are super important, but you don't always need those to test changes. So try shell scripts. And finally, having a staging environment, like if only my friend had a spare server to run her cleanup routine on, she would have maybe noticed that the server was going to crash before she ran it in production. One major failure can often convince management that you really need a staging environment. Not that I'm saying that you should, engineer one, but staging environments, great. So another failure out there is the failure to verify. And lest you think that I just point my fingers at other people, I'm going to tell you a story from my own life. Happened fairly recently. It was actually kind of inspiration for this talk. So I work a lot with Postgres, and I was a consultant for a few years. And it was my birthday. And we had this customer that had a very important data migration. They were in AWS, and they were a startup, whatever. And they really wanted to do it at midnight on my birthday. And I was like, oh man, this sucks. My husband had already gotten us a place to stay. We're gonna go to a show, it's gonna be awesome. So I was like, okay, here's what I'll do. I'll have my coworker actually write all the scripts and do everything, and I'll just kind of run shotgun, while or not shotgun, but on the side. I'll be co-pilot for this thing. So go to the show, have a great birthday, go to my hotel room, it's midnight, fire up my computer, and we begin. And this involved doing a PG dump. So how many of you here are familiar with 8.4 and earlier Postgres? Anybody? A few of you? So what does -d do? Anyone? No wrong answers. Well, not necessarily bad. Well, the correct answer before 8.4 is it does something different depending on which command line tool you're using. So, I did not test his scripts, and so I did not notice that his dump script dumped out insert statements instead of copy. And what that means is that when you restore it, it's going to be really, really slow. And this was in AWS, which, for those of you who are familiar, is really, really slow. So anyway, 2 hours later, we're like, this isn't done yet. What's going on? And we discovered the mistake. And 12 hours later, we were mostly done. So, what did I learn? First of all, have a plan for when things go wrong. We did not discuss what we were going to do if this would fail, because all of the tests that had run had finished in about 20 minutes in the staging environment. And so we hadn't talked to the customer really about, when the cutoff time would be, when we would really stop things, pull the plug, because we were like, oh, this is such an easy, simple change on my birthday at midnight. Second, when I say staging environment, definitions of this may vary, but one important thing about a staging environment is that it is the same, or really a lot the same as a production environment. We were testing with data that had just been generated from some silly script that really had nothing to do with the data that we were migrating, and so it was in fact that big when the data we were migrating was this big. Very different, right? So yeah, we failed in that regard. And finally, you need to test your rollback plan. And I guess that presupposes that you have a rollback plan, not just your implementation plan. And we had tested a rollback plan, but not one in a production environment. And so we were kind of stuck and just had to move forward. So verification tools here. I really think it's people a lot. It's having the staging environment and then having the people to really look at it and then not flaking out when you're getting ready for a maintenance window. You really do need to run through all this stuff yourself, because you might just catch a little typo like -D. So now we go into the other couple failures that I added at the end. First one is the failure to imagine. So my friend Maggie works for a fairly large university system, and the bottom line for them was that they couldn't trust anyone anymore. They're responsible for a bunch of data centers, and they were having a very interesting power problem. And none of the existing systems to monitor it detected it. They had, failover, they had UPSs and, surge protection and all that stuff, but what they got was a brownout. And it was a sustained brownout that lasted for, I think something on the order of 3 to 4 hours. And none of their systems detected it. In fact, their primary and secondary and then tertiary systems failed before they root caused what the issue was. That was a very expensive problem. And when they got together to kind of assess what they were going to do to solve this and have it never happen again in the future, a lot of fingers got pointed around. They were like, oh, the power company really needs to be monitoring this and detecting this and notifying us when something like this happens. The power company is not equipped to do that, at least not in her part of the world. I don't know if they could do better here, but they really didn't even know how to begin to do this properly for them. And so what they ended up doing after they rebought all of this really expensive rebought UPSs, was they installed their own monitoring at the point where power was coming into the university, so that they would know in the future when they had a brownout. And this is something that is still used as a lesson in their group today about how you just shouldn't trust incoming power or information. So failures of imagination are really difficult to deal with, right? It's your imagination. If you can't imagine it, how can you imagine it? I think really the most important thing is sharing stories of failure, because hearing about how other people are feeling helps you learn before maybe you make exactly that same mistake. I think another thing that's really important is just talking to people that are different than yourself. I often learn a lot from people who are not in IT, who work in the business world, who are artists, who are musicians, whatever. they experience very different types of failure than I experience on a daily basis, and sometimes that helps me, think outside the box there. And then the last thing I think that really helps with imagination is actually acting out your implementation scenario. Sometimes this is impossible in person because, I work from home, I work with a distributed team, but I still think that we can take lessons from the construction industry. Whenever you build something, at the end, you create a punch list. You walk through with people. You don't just sit in a room and talk about what's working and what's not working. You go out there and you look at it. And I think that particularly for maintenance windows, when you're moving equipment, like that example of the screws not coming out, if you were to actually go to the data center and look at what you needed to move, saw that several cables were just a little bit too short to reach, when you plug them back in, that would help prevent a lot of wasted time and money. So the last failure that I like to talk about is the failure to implement, which is probably the worst failure, right? Now you're rolling back, or maybe you're just utterly failing and running away, trying not to get burned on your way out. And the only way to recover from this is really to try to re-implement what it was that you were doing in the first place. And to me, that is learning from your mistakes. And this is the postmortem, right? Reflection is a part of pretty much any profession. My husband's a teacher, and one of the courses that they taught, an entire course on keeping a notebook and reflecting on a daily basis on your teaching so that you can learn from day to day about what's happening with your students, what's happening with yourself, and then to try to apply that to be a better teacher. And I think that we can learn a lot from that. And so anyway, so whenever I'm planning maintenance windows and outages, the first thing I plan to do is plan to have a postmortem. I'm making it clear with everyone from the beginning that this is going to be something that's going to happen, whether or not everything is successful. Because honestly, even if everything goes totally right, something went wrong. And I want to talk about it. So if you set that expectation, I think that people also deal with the idea of a postmortem in a much better way. I wish there was a better name for it, but I don't really know that there is, because everybody thinks that you go into this room and you're going to get blamed for things. But
Debrief.
Yeah, debrief. Yeah, you could say debrief. Yeah, I wish we had a better name. I don't know. I've tried a few different things. But everybody knows what this means, and those other things, I don't know. Let's talk about that after this. All right. So beforehand, you want to document your plan with numbered steps and also a timeline. I even do this with my meetings, which is kind of, I guess, weird. But I say that there's a certain amount of time that's going to be allocated for each one of these steps. And when I'm running through it, I try to see, am I going to meet those timelines? Am I going to meet my expectations? Also test the plan and test the rollback plan. And then there's always going to be a point of no return where you don't want to spend that much time. You don't want to spend 12 hours, maybe 2 might be okay. And you also have to ensure that there's enough time for you to actually roll everything back. So identifying that time and then having someone that's going to check on that time is really important. During maintenance windows, so I often work with a distributed team where nobody's in the same room, but even when people are in the same room, I tend to do this anyway, setting up some kind of screen sharing so that, for some reason I have to, I don't know, go to the bathroom, somebody else can pick up where I left off immediately without too much, IT wrangling. We also have a chat room, set up IRC, AIM, Campfire, whatever, something that has logging. Setting up a bot in IRC is great because then anybody can jump in and then look at the history and figure out what had happened. I also set up a voice line and have a headset. You can communicate so much faster when you're speaking. And you can also be typing at the same time, which is awesome. You don't have to take your hands off the keyboard when you're watching something that maybe is going well or not. And also, I like to designate a timekeeper, somebody whose sole job it is, not the person that's running the maintenance window, but someone else who can do time checks and make sure that if you reach that point of no return that you actually start your rollback plan. And afterward, like I said before, I try to schedule documentation updates as part of the whole plan and schedule the postmortem to identify those areas of concerns. And when we do the postmortem, we talk about the successes, we talk about the failures, and then we really only identify 1 or 2 things that we're actually going to try to change. Often people will come up with these like insanely long lists of every single thing that you can change, but really, let's be honest, 1 or 2 is probably what we're going to change. So just limit it to that, and then you can succeed when you actually do try to change things. So, if there's one thing that you take away, this is it. I think that just about covers it. Plan for the worst, minimize risk, fail, and recover gracefully. And you can also use this if it makes, people on your team laugh. Document, test, and verify. So I think I ended just a little bit early, so.
About 15 minutes.
We've got 15 minutes, so anybody want to tell some horrifying stories? I love it. Bring on the fail. Yes, in the front.
So initially, one thing, not a story, but you mentioned earlier on that define success and that restoring from backup is not success. But I actually completely disagree with that one, and in fact in many of our change control processes, the rollback is restore from backup because we define success as restoration of service, not that we've succeeded the change.
No, I agree with that.
Yeah. As for a story, failure to plan would be in the construction industry, in the roading industry, which is very relevant, which was digging up the southern motorway in Auckland, which is a rather important motorway, at 1 a.m. on a Sunday night / Monday morning with a plan that will be done by 3 a.m. Nobody thought about what to do when they made a mistake and when they were going to call the rollback and how long it would take to do a rollback. At 5 a.m. they decided they better roll back this change. Unfortunately, the change was not a script. The change was a ginormous hole in the middle of the motorway that was full. That was completely filled to the brim with sewage. That was constantly being pumped out. So putting a metal plate over it and tar sealing it, which is a 1-hour job and theoretically could have been done, would not work when sewage was pouring out of said hole. Aucklanders here may remember that day because it was the day when the motorway was effectively shut on a Monday morning.
See, stories like that make me really happy to work in IT. I'm like, yes.
Yeah. We deal with shit when routers fail. They deal with shit when shit fails.
Perfect. I'm so glad that was recorded. Yes.
Yeah, I've had 2 of the power failures power failures like you mentioned there. I've had the one where the UPS, the feed into the UPS was not good enough and it was running low, and I'm like, okay, fine, I'll monitor the inbound power on my UPSs to catch this.
Yeah, my friend Maggie calls that, there's like, brownouts to an individual computer. That sucks, right? And you're probably going to lose your computer. But, when you're talking about data centers and that much power, it's logarithmically more bad. And yeah, it's just terrible.
Well, then I learned to really not trust anything when the voltage regulator that we'd put in upstream from our one stopped working as well. Because previously I'd been monitoring for gross mistakes, because I'm expecting 230, tell me if it drops below 220 and I'll worry. Right. This time the voltage regulator just stopped working and it just fed through dirty power. And I was like, oh, so I actually have to monitor if you go out of band by a volt, because that means you've failed. So it was like,
wow,
catch me once, oh wait, you caught me twice.
Yeah. That's awesome. Brianna's here. Oh, oops.
So, in recent history, our organisation developed a cutover plan for a service to DR because that is the high availability plan for that service if we need to do anything to the service.
Right.
So we developed the plan, we tested the plan. Then we had server hardware failure in the production site, and we're gone, cool, we've got a plan. We're going to cut over to DR for a week, take this server out, replace the RAM in it, because I had RAM failure. Who has RAM failures? Anyway.
I do all the time.
Anyway, ECC errors in main RAM. Anyway,
Yeah.
3 days after cutting over to DR, The archive logs on the database server filled the box. Because when we tested the DR plan, we tested it for a day.
Yeah, test the whole plan. Yeah. Not just a fifth of it or a seventh of it, yeah.
And someone said, no, it was only a DR plan for going to DR for a day. And I said, no, it wasn't.
Yeah, that might also be read the plan. Sorry, I didn't include that in the slide. That was good. Nice.
Anyway.
So Brianna down here, and then maybe we can move the thing to the other side. Person with the mic, she's down here.
I just wanted to mention a report that might be of interest to people who like reading about failure that the Victorian Government Ombudsman released called Own Motion Investigation into ICT-Enabled Projects, where it was about public sector IT projects. And I think actually it was an excuse after we had a change of government for the new government to dump on the handling of these projects by the previous government.
Yeah.
But it is quite interesting reading, and so it covers 10 projects in a bunch of different departments, including Mikey is one of them. And so they talk about the themes, which are like leadership, accountability, governance, planning, project management. And so it's failure on a little bit larger scale than this, but for anyone who's interested, there's a lot of fail in there.
That's awesome. Want a link? Maybe move over to the other side. So I'm going to make you go everywhere. Yes.
Just on Victorian government fails, there's also an excellent book on the Longsford gas explosion.
The what?
So,
Sorry.
okay, this is a better anecdote than the one I was going to tell anyway. So there was a gas processing plant that handled around 90% of Victoria's natural gas needs. Now, over time, the engineers were moved off-site, and let's just say the management system for the plant became noisy, so it became routine to ignore. Ignore alerts.
Never mind that noise.
Those are just routine alerts. You can ignore those.
Yeah.
Eventually, what happened was it got too cold. It boiled over, there was a massive explosion, the entirety of Melbourne was without gas for, was it 2 weeks?
2 weeks.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, all of Victoria, not just
In the middle of winter.
Oh, that's sad.
Except for South Bank.
Yes, except for Crown Casino, who for 2 days were quite visibly using their very large gas burners. For 2 days.
Wow. All right.
I suspect we can collect a lot of great fail stories like that. And one I was told about the year 2000 problem in Queensland with the electricity generation. I was told by one of the engineers working there that they knew that the whole system for monitoring the boilers that maintain the steam pressure for the generators was not year 2000 compliant. They had no idea what would happen when year 2000 rolled over. So the engineers were trained, you'd go up to a boiler and hum at a certain frequency. And if it hummed back at a different frequency, you knew it was okay.
UI?
Yeah. But the one I wanted to ask about was, I was speaking to one of the developers in one of the projects that I work with.
Yeah.
Who said, we just don't have time to write any documentation because it's all there in the code. You know, the code is the documentation anyway.
Yeah.
And I really liked your idea of saying, okay, well, every process you do should just include a 5-minute or 10-minute or whatever, an amount of time for updating the documentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you have other ideas that you find can turn around people who are saying, oh no, it's way too expensive for us to actually, test our software, to get them to implement some of those things?
Put them on the on-call roster.
Spoken like someone who's been woken up
That
at
is
3
something that
a.m.
sysadmins are working on right now. But
Yeah.
Make sure you know your personal cell phone numbers.
Yeah, it's really, so dealing with people who really don't want to document anything, it's really hard. I mean, unless you have a management structure that is going to reinforce good behavior, it's often very difficult to change an individual person's behavior. So I don't have a great answer for that. I think the 5-minute thing often will help a lot. The other thing is sometimes I show people that they often can take user bug reports, good ones, and turn that into documentation, because often the user will, say, I did this, 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 and this, and then it exploded. And then you fix it, and that's a piece of documentation. And we've done that quite a bit, actually, for certain things in Postgres, for certain types of setting up the database, things that seeded a lot of wiki content, people just taking their emails. That was authoritative, yes. But yeah, so sorry, individual behavior is really difficult to change, but if maybe you can, management beat them and tell them that they have to do it, then sometimes.
If it's valuable enough, hire a tech writer to document for them.
Yeah, find a person that's willing. I generally try to convert the willing, so.
I just want to reinforce one of your comments earlier about the timekeeping. Our maintenance fails. We had a timekeeper, but the timekeeper was not independent of the people who were doing the maintenance procedure. In fact, it was me.
Right.
And the problem is with that, you get completely emotionally invested in seeing the thing through to a success.
Yeah.
5 minutes away.
Yeah, exactly. 5 minutes later, it's still only 5 minutes away, and double the length of your maintenance window later, you still have to execute your rollback plan.
Right.
So it's critically important that the timekeeper is not one of the people who's emotionally invested in seeing the change through.
Yeah, and one thing that I would say is for people that have good relationships with their customers, and so I've often worked for IT departments that are inside a company, and so my customers are inside my own company. We often would invite a customer to be part of the maintenance window so that they get to enjoy staying up until 4 a.m. with the rest of us. And then you give them a job, which is the timekeeping. So, that may be one way to get them involved from the beginning and have them see what's going on. And it also might help convince them that, maintenance windows that end at 4 a.m. are a bad idea.
Your customers are really smart if they can do that.
They can keep time?
Yeah.
Haha, not true. Okay, next.
I've been told that in the health industry they have a culture of a morbidity and mortality analysis when something bad happens, which is specifically a closed-door conversation where no blame is attributed. And we started doing that where I work, and it works quite well as a post-mortem when something bad does happen.
That sounds awesome. I want to know more about that.
Tell us more about it then.
Yeah. Maybe we should have a BOF about morbidity and mortality. And stickers. Okay. Yes?
We've got
Any
about
takers?
3 or 4 minutes left.
Anybody up here? Right up here?
So documentation is great, but if it's too cumbersome, nobody bothers reading it.
True.
And a large Australian bank about 7 or 8 years ago, they have a great change management system. It's exhaustive, you document everything. No one ever reads the changes because it's too painful.
I love write-only documentation.
One day, the guy who needed to do work on the city power came in when his change was scheduled, and the guy who was doing work on the UPS came in when the change was scheduled, and the guy who was doing work on the generators came in when the work was scheduled. And on that day, one of the big 4 Australian banks went down for a long time. But nobody wants to read the documentation. There's too much and it's too hard to use.
Yeah. Oh, man. Yeah, there was this terrible story in the Daily WTF just the other day about a guy that this company, they were not really very happy with his work, so they were kind of excited to send him off to decommission this. How many, have you guys already heard this? A couple of you probably have. Yeah, they sent him off to, I think it was like the Cayman Islands or something, to decommission a mothballed data center. And they had, the crux of the story is that there were 2 data centers on the island. I don't need to finish that sentence. Okay, next.
good. This will be the last question.
Okay.
Hey, it's actually a comment rather than a question. I agree with and appreciate everything you said about checklists and go, no-go points and things like that. One thing I would add to that is it's really good to have some decision-making guidelines before you go into a push or a migration, whatever you're going to do.
Right.
And one of the rules that we implemented early on was 3 strikes rule. For rollbacks. If 3 things go wrong, we're going to roll back.
Oh,
because
that's
at some
really
point
good.
you're just scrambling, and you should probably sit back and try again another day.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, 3 strikes. It's Laura from Mozilla. Hey. All right, well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
And on behalf of Linux Australia, I would like to thank you for your talk by presenting you with this gift.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. 10-minute break and then talk from Robert Meebus.